I heard my daughter-in-law whisper in the quiet of the church, "At least the house will finally be ours now," while my husband's coffin stood only a few feet away from the altar. The words floated through the still air of St. Andrew's like something sharp and out of place, and for a moment I wondered if I had imagined them, if grief had begun playing tricks on my mind. My name is Margaret Whitmore. I am 72 years old, and that morning I was sitting in the second pew of a small brick church in northern Pennsylvania, attending the Seventh-day Memorial Mass for my husband of 46 years. The early autumn sunlight filtered through the tall stained-glass windows, scattering quiet colors across the wooden floor, and the scent of polished oak mixed with the faint sweetness of the candles near the altar. Everything about the morning should have been peaceful, reverent, a final moment of dignity for the man who had built our life piece by piece over nearly half a century. Edward Whitmore had been a quiet man, steady as the mountains surrounding our town, the kind of husband who never forgot to fix the loose step on the porch or check the oil in the car before winter arrived. He believed in preparation, in order, in making sure that the people he loved would never have to struggle if he could help it. Yet there I was, sitting with my hands folded around a small prayer book, listening to my daughter-in-law speak as if the man in the coffin had already been reduced to paperwork and property lines. I did not turn my head right away. Instead I kept my eyes on the altar where the priest was arranging the chalice and the linen cloth, his movements slow and deliberate, as if time itself had become careful in that sacred room. Behind me, the soft creak of pews and the quiet rustle of coats told me that relatives and neighbors were settling into their seats. Our town was the kind where everyone came to a memorial service, whether they had known the person for 40 years or only nodded to them at the grocery store once a week. Edward had known almost everyone here. He had built half the houses within 5 miles, including the one where I still lived, the white 2-story home with the wraparound porch and the maple tree he planted the year our son Daniel was born. Daniel sat 2 rows ahead of me now, his back straight, his dark suit still stiff from the store hanger. Next to him sat his wife, Ashley, the woman whose voice I had just heard slicing through the quiet of the church like an impatient remark at a business meeting. She leaned slightly toward the woman beside her, her hand resting on the back of the pew, her tone lowered but not nearly enough. "At least the house will finally be ours now," she murmured again, as if repeating the thought made it more real. The woman beside her gave a soft, uncomfortable laugh, the kind people use when they are not sure whether they should respond or pretend they did not hear. My fingers tightened slightly around the edge of the prayer book, but my face remained calm. Years of marriage had taught me something important: silence often carries more strength than argument. Edward used to say that reacting too quickly gives other people control over your story. I could almost hear his voice in my mind now, the same calm tone he used whenever Daniel came home from school angry about something small and temporary. "Let people reveal themselves first," he would tell our son. "Truth takes its time, but it always shows up." The organ began to play softly at the front of the church, the low notes rolling through the room like distant thunder, and the congregation rose to their feet. I stood as well, smoothing the sleeve of my black dress, the one Edward had once said made me look elegant enough for a governor's dinner even though we had never attended anything fancier than a church fundraiser. My silver hair was pinned neatly at the back of my head, and around my neck hung the small gold cross my mother had given me on my wedding day in 1977. The weight of it felt heavier than usual, though perhaps that was simply the weight of the morning itself. As the priest began the opening prayer, I allowed my eyes to rest briefly on the polished wooden coffin at the front of the sanctuary. Edward had chosen that coffin years ago during one of his strange moments of practical planning. He had walked into the funeral home on a rainy Tuesday afternoon, pointed to the simple walnut one, and told the director, "That'll do." I remember teasing him later about the way he handled serious matters like a man buying lumber for a porch repair. But that was Edward. Quiet. Organized. Always thinking 10 steps ahead. And suddenly I remembered something he had said only 3 weeks before he passed away. We had been sitting on the back porch just after sunset, the air warm enough for iced tea but cool enough that the crickets had already begun their evening chorus. He had looked at the maple tree in the yard for a long moment before speaking. "If anything ever happens to me," he said, almost casually, "you remember Robert Keller." I had frowned slightly at the time, thinking he was talking about insurance or one of the usual practical matters he handled so carefully. Robert Keller was our longtime attorney, a quiet man who had helped Edward structure the business years ago when Whitmore Construction finally grew from a pickup truck and a toolbox into a respectable local company. Why would I need Robert? I asked him that evening, half amused by the seriousness in his voice. Edward only smiled in that small, knowing way he had. Just trust me on that, he said. At the time, the words felt like another one of his tidy preparations for a distant future. Now, standing in that church while Ashley whispered about my home as if it were already a prize waiting to be claimed, those words suddenly returned with a clarity that made my chest tighten slightly. The priest continued speaking, his voice calm and steady as he led the congregation through the prayers of remembrance. Around me I could hear quiet sniffles and the shifting of shoes on the wooden floor. Edward had been well respected in this town. Many people here owed their roofs, their kitchens, or their repaired porches to the careful work of his hands. Yet grief, I was beginning to realize, does not always bring out the same respect in family that it does in neighbors. I kept my gaze forward and my expression peaceful, but inside my thoughts had begun arranging themselves with the same slow precision Edward once used when measuring the frame of a house. Ashley believed the future had already been decided. Daniel, sitting silently beside her, had not corrected her words. And somewhere in the quiet corners of my memory, Edward's voice still echoed, "Trust Robert Keller." I lowered my eyes briefly to the prayer book again, letting the words of the Mass flow around me like a calm river, while the first small pieces of understanding began to settle into place. I remained seated for a few moments after the memorial Mass ended, listening to the slow shuffle of shoes along the church floor as people began to leave their pews. The organ played a soft closing hymn that drifted through the sanctuary like a gentle wind, and the priest stood near the altar greeting families with quiet condolences. I closed my prayer book carefully and held it in my lap, allowing the crowd to thin before I stood. Edward had never liked crowded exits. Even during Sunday services he always waited until the end, letting everyone else move ahead while he nodded politely to neighbors from a distance. I realized I was doing the same thing now without thinking. Some habits become part of you after nearly half a century together. When I finally rose from the pew, the late morning sunlight had grown brighter through the stained glass, casting warm colors across the wooden floor. For a brief moment the church looked almost peaceful again, as if the earlier whisper had never happened. Yet the words were still there in my memory, quiet but sharp, like a small crack in glass that only becomes visible when the light hits it the right way. At the front of the church, Daniel stood beside Ashley speaking with two distant relatives who had driven down from Scranton. Daniel's posture looked formal, the way he always stood during business meetings at the construction company, his shoulders straight and his hands folded neatly in front of him. Ashley, however, spoke with animated confidence, gesturing lightly with one hand while the other rested on Daniel's arm. I could not hear her exact words this time, but the tone was familiar. It was the tone of someone discussing plans that had already been decided. I walked slowly down the center aisle, pausing briefly when Mrs. Caldwell, our neighbor from 2 houses down, reached for my hand. She was nearly 80 and had known Edward since he helped repair her roof after a heavy winter storm 15 years ago. Her eyes looked kind and tired at the same time. "Your husband was a good man, Margaret," she said quietly. "This town will remember him for a long time." I thanked her with a small smile. That was another thing Edward believed in deeply. Reputation was not built through speeches or attention. It was built through steady work and simple kindness repeated over many years. Outside the church doors the air felt crisp with the first hints of autumn. A line of cars filled the gravel parking lot, their windshields catching the bright late morning sun. Several people stood in small groups speaking quietly before heading home, their voices low out of respect for the day. Daniel and Ashley joined them a moment later, and as I stepped outside I saw Ashley speaking again to the same woman who had laughed earlier during the service. This time her voice carried a little farther across the open space. "Daniel and I will probably renovate the place next spring," she said lightly. "The house has good bones, but it could really use modern updates." For a moment the conversation around them paused slightly, the way conversations sometimes do when someone realizes a remark may have traveled farther than expected. Ashley noticed me then. Her expression shifted quickly into something polite and carefully sympathetic. She walked toward me with measured steps, her heels clicking softly on the pavement. "Margaret," she said gently, placing a hand on my arm. "How are you holding up today?" Her voice carried a smooth tone that would have sounded convincing to anyone who had not heard her earlier whisper. I looked at her calmly. "It is a quiet day," I said. That answer seemed to satisfy her, or perhaps she simply preferred not to linger on the subject. Daniel approached a moment later, his face showing the tired strain that follows a long week of funeral arrangements and family gatherings. "Mom, some of us are heading over to the diner on Route 20 for lunch," he said. "Just a small group. You are welcome to come if you feel up to it." I noticed the way he spoke carefully, as if choosing words that would not disturb the delicate balance of the moment. Daniel had always been thoughtful like that as a child, careful not to upset people even when he disagreed with them. Yet standing there in the parking lot, I also noticed something else. He had heard Ashley speak about the house. And he had not corrected her. I placed my hand lightly on his sleeve. "Thank you, Daniel," I said softly. "But I think I will go home for a little while." The word home seemed to settle between us for a moment, though neither of them commented on it. Ashley simply nodded and offered another gentle smile before returning to her conversation. I walked toward my car, the same dark blue sedan Edward and I had purchased 5 years earlier after our old station wagon finally gave out. The drive home took less than 10 minutes, winding through the familiar streets of our town where nearly every corner held some memory of our life together. The hardware store where Edward bought nails and paint supplies. The small park where Daniel learned to ride his bicycle. The diner where Edward and I sometimes shared pancakes on Saturday mornings before the workday began. When I pulled into the driveway of our house, the maple tree in the yard stood quietly in the sunlight, its leaves just beginning to shift from green toward the deep orange that would come later in October. Edward had planted that tree the year Daniel turned 1. He said he wanted something that would grow alongside our family. I sat in the car for a moment before going inside, listening to the quiet ticking sound of the cooling engine. The house itself looked exactly as it always had. White siding, dark shutters, and the wide porch Edward built with his own hands nearly 30 years ago. To Ashley it might have been a property waiting for renovation. To me it was the place where every chapter of my adult life had unfolded. I stepped out of the car and walked slowly toward the front door. As I reached for the handle, Edward's words from that evening on the porch returned again with surprising clarity. "If anything ever happens to me, remember Robert Keller." I stood there for a moment with my hand resting on the door. Edward had rarely repeated advice unless it truly mattered. And suddenly the quiet memory of his voice felt less like a distant thought and more like the beginning of an answer that had not yet fully revealed itself. I stood inside the quiet house for a long moment after closing the front door, listening to the familiar stillness that had filled every room since Edward passed away. The refrigerator hummed softly in the kitchen, and somewhere down the hallway the old grandfather clock ticked with the steady patience that had measured the rhythm of our lives for decades. Nothing inside the house had changed since the morning of the memorial service, yet the words I had heard in the church parking lot lingered in my mind like a question waiting for its answer. Ashley's voice had been confident when she spoke about renovating the house, about springtime plans that seemed to assume the place already belonged to her and Daniel. It was not the words alone that troubled me. It was the certainty behind them. I walked slowly into the living room where Edward's favorite armchair still faced the front window. The cushion held the slight curve that had formed after years of him sitting there each evening reading the local newspaper or reviewing construction estimates. I placed my hand lightly on the back of the chair and allowed myself a quiet breath. Edward had always believed that when something did not feel right, the best response was not anger but patience. "Look at the details," he used to say. "Details tell the truth." The memory of his voice reminded me again of the conversation on the porch 3 weeks before he died. "Remember Robert Keller." At the time the remark seemed like one of Edward's practical habits, the same kind of careful planning he used when organizing tools in the garage or labeling folders in his office. But now, standing in the quiet house that Ashley had already begun discussing as if it were hers, the memory felt different. I walked into the kitchen and poured a glass of water, then sat at the small oak table where Edward and I had shared countless breakfasts before he left for work each morning. Outside the window the maple tree moved gently in the breeze, its leaves catching sunlight that made them shimmer like copper coins. For a moment I simply watched the branches sway, letting the calm settle my thoughts. Then I stood and walked down the hallway to Edward's office. The room smelled faintly of cedar from the bookshelves he had built himself many years ago. His desk remained exactly as he left it, with neatly stacked folders, a brass letter opener, and the small framed photograph of Daniel as a boy holding a fishing rod beside the lake near our town. Edward never liked clutter, and even now his workspace looked organized with the same quiet precision that defined his character. I opened the top drawer of the desk and looked through the envelopes and documents he kept there. Most were ordinary papers related to the business or the house, things I had seen before. But near the back of the drawer I noticed a cream-colored envelope with Robert Keller's law office printed neatly in the corner. I held it in my hands for a moment, feeling the weight of the thick paper inside. Edward had always respected Robert Keller. They had worked together for nearly 20 years, beginning when Whitmore Construction expanded from small repairs into full home projects across the county. Robert was a careful man, the kind of attorney who spoke slowly and preferred thorough preparation over quick decisions. I remembered Edward once saying that Robert approached legal matters the same way a good carpenter approaches a frame for a house. Measure carefully. Build strong. Leave nothing unstable. I placed the envelope back into the drawer without opening it. Something about the moment told me that rushing would not help me understand what Edward intended. Instead I closed the drawer and sat quietly in Edward's chair. From that position I could see the entire backyard through the office window, including the porch where Edward and I had shared so many evenings watching the sunset fade over the hills. That was where he told me about Robert Keller. I remembered the exact way he leaned back in the porch chair, the quiet smile he gave when I asked why the lawyer might matter in the future. "Just trust me on that," he had said. Edward was not a man who enjoyed mysteries, but he did believe in preparing for possibilities. As I sat there thinking about his words, the sound of tires crunching lightly on the gravel driveway reached my ears. I looked through the window and saw a small blue sedan pulling in behind my car. A moment later the engine stopped and the driver's door opened. Emma stepped out. My granddaughter was 17 years old, tall like her father but with the thoughtful eyes Edward always said reminded him of my younger sister. She looked toward the house with a hesitant expression, as if she had not entirely decided whether to knock on the door or return to the car. I stood and walked to the front hallway just as the doorbell rang. When I opened the door Emma gave me a quick hug, the kind that carried the nervous energy of someone holding something important inside. "Grandma, I hope it is okay that I stopped by," she said softly. I assured her that she was always welcome. She stepped into the house and glanced around the living room before sitting at the edge of the sofa. For a few seconds she seemed unsure where to begin. Finally she looked up at me with the same quiet honesty that Edward admired so much in her. "Grandma," she said carefully, "there is something I think you should know about what Mom said earlier today." I sat down beside her without interrupting. Emma took a slow breath. "When we were leaving the church parking lot," she continued, "Mom told Aunt Melissa that the house would finally belong to them now. She said that once everything was settled you would probably move somewhere smaller." Emma paused for a moment, watching my face as if she expected me to react with shock or anger. But I simply nodded gently. "I heard her say something similar," I replied. Emma looked relieved and worried at the same time. "I did not think it sounded right," she said quietly. "Grandpa loved this house. He always said it was your home." I looked toward the hallway that led to Edward's office. The cream-colored envelope with Robert Keller's name rested inside the desk drawer exactly where Edward placed it. And for the first time since the memorial service ended, the quiet pieces of Edward's careful planning began to feel less like distant memories and more like the beginning of a truth that had not yet fully come into the light. Emma's words remained in the room long after she finished speaking, hanging quietly in the air like dust drifting through sunlight. I watched her carefully, noticing the nervous way she folded her hands together on her lap. She was young, but she had always been observant, and Edward used to say that Emma had the rare ability to notice what people said when they believed no one important was listening. I reached across the small space between us and placed my hand gently over hers. "Thank you for telling me," I said softly. Emma nodded, though she still looked uneasy. "I did not want you to be surprised later," she said. "Mom has been talking about the house for a while." That sentence settled quietly in my mind. For a moment I looked past Emma toward the hallway that led to Edward's office, and suddenly the past few months began arranging themselves differently in my memory. Small moments that once seemed ordinary now carried a different weight. I remembered Ashley asking Edward about the age of the house during dinner last spring. She had said it in a casual tone, almost playful, but the question had been oddly specific. "How old is this place exactly?" she asked while looking around the dining room as if measuring the space. Edward had smiled politely and told her the house was built in 1978, the year after Daniel was born. At the time I thought nothing of the conversation. People often admire old houses in small towns. But later that same evening Ashley asked another question. "Do you think it would be possible to open up the kitchen wall someday?" she said. "A lot of homes are doing open floor plans now." Edward only chuckled and replied that the kitchen wall was load-bearing and had been designed to support the second floor. He explained it in the calm, patient way he used whenever someone asked about construction details. I remember Ashley nodding thoughtfully, as if filing the information away for later. Sitting beside Emma on the sofa now, that memory no longer felt like an innocent conversation about architecture. It felt like the early stages of a plan. Emma looked toward the hallway as well, following my gaze. "Grandpa always loved this house," she said quietly. I smiled slightly. "He did," I replied. "Your grandfather believed that a home should feel steady. Like a place that stays the same even when everything else changes." Emma glanced at the family photographs arranged along the mantel above the fireplace. There was one of Daniel at age 10 holding a baseball trophy. Another showed Edward and me standing beside the maple tree the year it was planted. Emma stood and walked closer to that photograph, studying it with thoughtful eyes. "Mom says houses are investments," she said slowly. "But Grandpa never talked about it that way." I stood and joined her near the fireplace. "Your grandfather built houses for people," I said. "But he believed a home was something different. Something that carried memories." Emma nodded, though the quiet tension in her expression remained. After a moment she turned back toward me. "Grandma, did Grandpa ever say anything about what was supposed to happen with the house?" she asked carefully. The question was simple, but it opened the door to the thought that had been circling quietly in my mind since the morning of the memorial service. I thought again about Edward's voice on the porch 3 weeks before he passed away. "If anything ever happens to me, remember Robert Keller." I had not understood the importance of those words at the time. But now they felt like a small light beginning to glow in the distance of a long hallway. "Your grandfather trusted Robert Keller very much," I said thoughtfully. Emma's eyebrows lifted slightly. "The lawyer?" she asked. I nodded. "Yes. They worked together for many years. When the construction business started growing, Robert helped your grandfather organize everything properly." Emma seemed to consider that information carefully. "So Robert would know about Grandpa's plans?" she asked. I did not answer immediately. Instead I walked slowly toward the hallway and paused at the doorway to Edward's office. The room looked exactly the way it had earlier that afternoon, quiet and orderly, the sunlight now shifting slightly across the desk as the day moved toward early evening. Emma followed a step behind me and stood beside the doorframe. "Grandma," she said gently. I walked over to Edward's desk and opened the top drawer again. The cream-colored envelope with Robert Keller's name remained where I had placed it earlier. I lifted it carefully and turned it over in my hands. The paper was thick and formal, the kind used for legal correspondence that carried importance without needing decoration. Emma watched silently as I studied the envelope. "Did Grandpa leave that for you?" she asked. I nodded slowly. "I believe he did," I said. For a moment I considered opening it right there at the desk. But something inside me hesitated. Edward had always believed that important matters deserved the right moment. He never rushed decisions, even small ones. Instead, he gathered information first and looked at the situation from every side. I set the envelope back into the drawer and closed it gently. Emma looked surprised. "You are not going to open it?" she asked. I smiled faintly. "Not yet," I said. "Your grandfather rarely repeated advice unless it truly mattered. If he told me to remember Robert Keller, there was probably a reason." Emma seemed to relax slightly at that answer, as if the calm tone reassured her that the situation was not as simple as Ashley believed. Outside the office window, the late afternoon sunlight had begun turning golden, casting long shadows across the yard and the maple tree Edward planted so many years ago. I stood quietly beside the desk, looking out at the branches moving gently in the breeze. Somewhere beyond the hills the sun was beginning its slow descent toward evening. And for the first time since Ashley's whisper in the church, I felt something steady returning to my thoughts. Edward had prepared carefully for many things in life. It seemed increasingly likely that he had prepared for this moment as well. The evening light had begun to soften when Emma finally stood near the doorway of Edward's office, glancing once more at the quiet room before preparing to leave. The house had grown calmer in the gentle way homes often do after a long day, the late afternoon breeze moving lightly through the maple branches outside the window while the grandfather clock in the hallway measured time with slow, steady patience. Emma hugged me again near the front door before stepping onto the porch, promising she would visit again soon. I watched her car disappear down the road before closing the door behind me. The quiet that followed felt different than it had earlier in the afternoon. It was no longer the empty quiet of grief alone. Now it carried something else beneath it, something thoughtful and steady, like the early stages of understanding. I walked back down the hallway toward Edward's office, passing the photographs that lined the wall. Each one captured a moment of our family's life: Daniel in his high school graduation gown, Edward standing proudly beside a newly completed home, Emma smiling beside the lake during a summer fishing trip. These were the kinds of memories Edward valued most. Not the value of property or investments, but the moments that built the story of a family over time. When I entered the office again, the room felt exactly as Edward left it, calm and orderly, the desk neatly arranged beneath the soft glow of the desk lamp. I sat down slowly in his chair and rested my hands on the smooth wood surface. The envelope with Robert Keller's name remained inside the drawer, waiting quietly like a question that had not yet been asked. For several minutes I simply sat there, listening to the faint sounds of the evening settling around the house. Somewhere outside a car passed along the road, and the wind brushed gently against the porch railing Edward built so many years ago. Eventually I stood, walked to the window, and looked out toward the yard. The maple tree stood tall against the fading sky, its leaves glowing faintly in the last light of the day. Edward had planted that tree with careful attention, measuring the space in the yard before digging the hole himself. He said trees should be placed thoughtfully because they grow into something that shapes the future of a home. The memory made me smile slightly. Edward believed in planning not just for the next week or the next year, but for the years that would come long after a moment had passed. I returned to the desk and opened the drawer once more. The envelope felt heavier in my hands this time, though perhaps that was only because I now understood its importance. Robert Keller had been Edward's attorney for many years. More than that, he had been someone Edward trusted with the kind of details that most people overlook until it is too late. I remembered one evening nearly a decade ago when Edward and Robert sat at this same desk reviewing paperwork while I brought them coffee. They spoke quietly about business structure, property titles, and legal protections. At the time the conversation sounded complicated and distant from daily life, but Edward seemed satisfied afterward, as if a long-term responsibility had been handled correctly. That was the way he approached nearly everything. He believed that careful preparation protected the people you loved. I turned the envelope over slowly and examined the seal. It had not been opened since Robert's office sent it. For a brief moment I considered breaking the seal right there. Yet Edward's words returned to me again with quiet clarity. Remember Robert Keller. He had not said open the envelope. He had said remember the man who sent it. That distinction felt important. Edward chose his words carefully. If he wanted me to understand something, there was always a reason behind the way he said it. I placed the envelope back into the drawer and closed it gently once more. Instead of opening the letter, I reached for the telephone on the desk. The number for Keller and Whitman law offices was still written neatly on a small notepad Edward kept beside the phone. I stared at the number for a moment before dialing. The line rang twice before a familiar voice answered. Keller and Whitman law offices, this is Robert Keller speaking. His voice carried the same calm professionalism I remembered from years ago. Robert, I said softly. This is Margaret Whitmore. There was a brief pause on the line, followed by a warm and respectful tone. Margaret. I have been meaning to reach out to you. I was very sorry to hear about Edward. I thanked him quietly. After a moment he continued speaking, his voice lowering slightly as if he had been expecting this conversation. Edward asked me to speak with you if anything happened, Robert said. In fact, he was very specific about that. I sat down again in Edward's chair, the same chair where my husband had spent so many evenings reviewing documents and planning projects. I believe he told me to remember you, I replied. Robert gave a small thoughtful laugh on the other end of the line. That sounds exactly like something Edward would say, he replied. Then his tone shifted gently towards something more serious. Margaret, there are several matters Edward arranged before he passed away. I think it would be best if we discussed them together in my office. I glanced out the office window again toward the quiet yard and the maple tree standing firmly in the fading light. When would be a good time? I asked. Robert answered without hesitation. Tomorrow morning would be ideal. Edward left clear instructions, and I believe you should hear them directly. I thanked him and ended the call. For a moment I remained seated in silence, letting the calm weight of the conversation settle into my thoughts. Ashley had spoken with certainty in the church parking lot earlier that day, as if the future of this house had already been decided. But Edward had spent his entire life building things carefully and leaving nothing unfinished. As the evening shadows deepened outside the office window, I began to understand that the quiet preparations he made might reach further into the future than anyone had expected. I woke early the next morning before the sun had fully risen above the hills surrounding our town. The house was quiet in the peaceful way it often was during the early hours, when the world outside had not yet begun its usual rhythm of passing cars and distant lawn mowers. For a moment I remained in bed listening to the soft ticking of the grandfather clock down the hallway and the faint rustling of leaves outside the bedroom window. Edward used to wake at this same hour nearly every morning, long before the construction crews arrived at their job sites. He believed that starting the day calmly gave a person time to think clearly before the noise of life filled the hours ahead. I dressed slowly and walked into the kitchen where the sunlight had just begun to touch the edge of the maple tree in the yard. The kettle warmed on the stove while I prepared a simple breakfast, though my thoughts remained focused on the conversation I had with Robert Keller the evening before. Edward had left clear instructions, Robert had said. Those words carried a quiet certainty that reminded me very much of my husband. Edward rarely spoke in vague terms when something mattered. When he made arrangements, he did so carefully and completely. After finishing breakfast I gathered my coat and stepped outside onto the porch. The air carried the cool freshness of early autumn, and the town streets were still mostly empty. The drive to Robert Keller's office took about 20 minutes, following the same familiar route Edward and I had traveled many times over the years. As I drove through town I passed the hardware store, the diner on Route 20, and the small park where Daniel once practiced baseball as a boy. Each place held pieces of our life together, quiet reminders of the years Edward and I spent building something steady for our family. Robert's office was located in a modest brick building near the courthouse square. It was the kind of place Edward respected, simple and well-maintained without unnecessary display. When I entered the reception area, the secretary greeted me warmly and asked me to take a seat while Robert finished a brief phone call. The office smelled faintly of polished wood and paper files, the same familiar scent I remembered from earlier visits years ago. A few minutes later Robert Keller appeared in the doorway of his office and offered me a calm, welcoming smile. He was slightly older than Edward had been, with neatly combed gray hair and the careful manner of someone who believed in precision. Margaret, he said kindly, shaking my hand. Please come in. His office looked orderly and professional, with tall bookshelves lined with legal volumes and a large wooden desk positioned near the window. As I sat across from him, Robert opened a thick folder that had been placed neatly on the corner of his desk. He paused for a moment before speaking, as if choosing his words with the same care Edward often used when discussing serious matters. "Edward visited my office several times over the past year," Robert began. "During those meetings he made a number of arrangements designed to protect you and to ensure that certain assets would be handled according to his wishes." I listened quietly, feeling the calm steadiness that Edward's memory often brought to difficult moments. Robert continued. "Your husband was very thoughtful about the future of your home and the construction business. He believed it was important that everything remained stable for you regardless of circumstances." He turned one of the documents in the folder toward me so I could see the official letterhead and signatures across the page. "Edward established a family trust several months ago," Robert explained. "The trust includes the Whitmore residence, the construction company assets, and several investment accounts." I looked at the document carefully while he spoke, noticing Edward's signature written in the confident hand I knew so well. "Under the terms of this trust," Robert continued, "you are the sole trustee and primary beneficiary for the remainder of your lifetime. That means you maintain full control over the house, the business interests, and all related financial decisions." For a moment the quiet office seemed even stiller than before. Ashley's words from the church parking lot returned briefly to my mind. "At least the house will finally be ours now." I felt no anger as the memory surfaced, only a calm recognition of how thoroughly Edward had anticipated the future. Robert folded his hands together on the desk and continued speaking. "Edward also included specific provisions regarding inheritance after your lifetime. Those provisions ensure that the property remains protected and cannot be transferred or sold without your approval." I nodded slowly as the meaning of Edward's careful planning became clear. My husband had not simply hoped that things would work out. He had designed a structure that made certain they would. Robert leaned back slightly in his chair. "Your husband asked me to explain all of this to you personally," he said. "He believed that once you understood the full arrangement, you would know exactly how to proceed." I looked out the office window toward the courthouse square where the morning sunlight now filled the street. Edward had spent his life building homes that were meant to last for generations. Now it seemed he had built something equally strong for the future of his own family. After a moment I turned back toward Robert Keller and gave a small thoughtful smile. The quiet certainty in my husband's preparations had already begun revealing itself, and I understood now why he had told me to remember the one person who knew the entire design. I left Robert Keller's office just before noon, stepping out into the quiet brightness of the courthouse square with a feeling I had not expected to experience so soon after Edward's memorial service. It was not relief exactly, and it was not satisfaction either. It was something steadier than both of those emotions, something closer to the calm understanding that Edward had already anticipated the future more carefully than anyone else in our family realized. The morning sun warmed the brick sidewalks as I walked slowly toward my car, and for a moment I paused beside the old fountain in the center of the square. Edward and I had passed this same fountain dozens of times over the years while running errands around town, but today it seemed to carry a new kind of quiet meaning. Edward had built houses his entire life, yet what he left behind for me was not simply a building made of wood and nails. He had built a structure of decisions, protections, and careful planning that would stand just as firmly as any house he ever constructed. The drive home felt different from the drive earlier. That morning, as I passed the diner on Route 20 and the small park where Daniel once practiced baseball, I noticed that the memories attached to those places no longer felt uncertain. Instead, they felt anchored by the quiet certainty of Edward's arrangements. When I pulled into the driveway, the maple tree stood exactly as it had the day before, its branches moving gently in the early afternoon breeze. The house itself looked peaceful and unchanged, the white siding bright beneath the sunlight and the porch steps worn slightly smooth from decades of footsteps. I stepped inside and placed my purse on the small table near the front door. The familiar smell of cedar from Edward's office drifted faintly through the hallway, and the grandfather clock continued its steady ticking as if nothing in the world had shifted. Yet inside my thoughts something had shifted completely. Edward had created a trust that placed the house, the business assets, and the investments under my control for the rest of my life. The arrangement was clear: legally sound, and impossible to misunderstand once the documents were explained. I walked slowly into the kitchen and poured a glass of water before sitting at the small oak table where Edward and I once shared so many quiet breakfasts. Outside the window the maple leaves shimmered gently in the sunlight, their movement almost rhythmic. For several minutes I simply watched them while considering the conversations that would eventually take place. Ashley believed the house would soon belong to her and Daniel. She had spoken with that certainty in the church parking lot and again during conversations with relatives. But Edward's careful planning meant that belief rested on an assumption rather than reality. I did not feel any urgency to correct that assumption immediately. Edward often said that truth reveals itself most clearly when people have already shown what they truly expect. The quiet of the house continued around me while the afternoon slowly unfolded. After finishing my water I walked into Edward's office and sat once again in his chair, opening the folder Robert Keller had given me before leaving his office. Inside were copies of the trust documents, carefully organized with clear language explaining each provision. I read through the pages slowly, noticing how thoroughly Edward had considered every detail. The house could not be sold or transferred without my consent. The construction business. Assets remained protected within the trust structure. Even the investment accounts were designed to provide stable income for as long as I needed them. Robert Keller had been correct when he said Edward left clear instructions. By the time I finished reviewing the final page, the quiet confidence I had felt outside the courthouse square had settled firmly into place. Edward had not left anything uncertain. I closed the folder and placed it carefully on the desk. Just then the sound of a car pulling into the driveway reached my ears through the open office window. A moment later the front door opened and familiar voices carried through the hallway. Daniel and Ashley had arrived. I remained seated at the desk for a moment, listening to their footsteps as they moved through the living room. Ashley's voice sounded cheerful and energetic, the way it often did when she believed a conversation would go her way. "Margaret," she called out politely. I stood from the chair and walked calmly into the hallway. Daniel looked slightly tired, but Ashley smiled warmly as if nothing unusual had happened the previous day. "We wanted to stop by and see how you were doing," she said. "And also to talk about a few practical things." I nodded gently and invited them to sit in the living room. The three of us settled into our usual places, Daniel in the armchair near the window, Ashley on the sofa, and I in the chair across from them. For a moment there was a polite silence while Daniel cleared his throat. "Mom," he began carefully, "Ashley and I have been thinking about the future of the house." Ashley leaned forward slightly, her expression earnest. "This place is beautiful," she said. "But it is also a lot for one person to manage. Daniel and I were wondering if you might consider something smaller eventually. Maybe a nice condominium closer to town. That way we could start making plans for the house here." I listened quietly without interrupting, the same way Edward used to listen during business negotiations when someone believed they understood the situation better than they actually did. Ashley continued speaking, outlining ideas about renovations and property improvements, her tone confident and optimistic. When she finally paused, I looked calmly at both of them. Edward's voice seemed almost present in the room, reminding me of the steady patience he valued so much. The truth had already been arranged long before this conversation began, and soon enough it would reveal itself in its own time. I listened patiently while Ashley finished describing her plans for the house, her voice filled with the kind of confident enthusiasm that people often have when they believe the future has already aligned with their expectations. Daniel sat quietly beside her, nodding occasionally as she spoke, though his expression carried a hint of uncertainty that I had learned to recognize over the years. When Ashley finally paused, the room grew still for a moment. The afternoon sunlight filtered through the living room windows, casting soft patterns across the floor and the familiar furniture Edward and I had chosen decades ago. I folded my hands calmly in my lap, letting the silence linger just long enough for the weight of her words to settle. "You have clearly thought about this quite a bit," I said gently. Ashley smiled, relieved perhaps that I had not interrupted her earlier explanation. "We just want to make sure everything is practical for the future," she replied. "This house is wonderful, but it is also very large. Eventually it might be easier for everyone if Daniel and I took over the property and made some updates. You would not have to worry about maintaining such a big place. Daniel shifted slightly in his chair and glanced at me, as if searching for a reaction. I noticed the way his hands rested uneasily on the armrests. He had always been thoughtful, even as a child, but Ashley often spoke with a certainty that moved conversations forward before he had fully decided how he felt. I leaned back slightly in my chair and looked around the living room. The photographs on the mantel remained exactly where they had always been, and Edward's armchair near the window still carried the quiet presence of the many evenings he had spent reading there. For a moment I allowed my eyes to rest on the maple tree outside the window. Its leaves moved softly in the breeze, glowing golden in the late afternoon light. Edward planted that tree with the belief that it would outlive many seasons of change. Then I turned my attention back to Daniel and Ashley. I understand your concerns about practicality, I said calmly. And it is thoughtful of you to consider the future. Ashley nodded, encouraged by my tone. Exactly, she said. We just want to make sure everything is handled in a way that benefits the family. The word family hung quietly in the air. Edward valued that word deeply. To him it meant responsibility, patience, and respect for the people who shared your life. I remained silent for a moment longer before speaking again. This morning I had a meeting with Robert Keller, I said. Ashley's expression shifted almost immediately, though she tried to maintain her polite smile. Daniel's eyebrows lifted slightly in surprise. You met with Mr. Keller? He asked. Yes, I replied calmly. Your father visited him several times before he passed away. There were some matters he wanted to make sure I understood. Ashley leaned forward a little on the sofa. Legal matters? She asked carefully. I nodded. Your father believed in preparing things properly. Daniel's posture straightened slightly, and I could see the familiar curiosity in his expression. What kind of arrangements? He asked. I reached toward the small folder I had placed on the side table earlier that afternoon and lifted it gently into my hands. The papers inside were neatly organized, exactly as Robert Keller had prepared them. I did not open the folder immediately. Instead I looked at both of them calmly, allowing the quiet patience Edward often practiced during important conversations. Ashley spoke again, her tone still confident but now slightly cautious. Is everything all right? She asked. I smiled faintly. Everything is exactly as your father intended, I said. Then I opened the folder and placed the first document carefully on the coffee table between us. Daniel leaned forward to read it while Ashley followed his gaze. The room remained completely silent except for the faint ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. After a moment Daniel looked up, confusion and surprise crossing his face at the same time. A trust, he said slowly. Ashley's expression tightened slightly as she continued reading the document. I watched them both quietly, feeling the same calm certainty that had settled in my thoughts since leaving Robert Keller's office earlier that day. Your father established the Whitmore Family Trust several months ago, I explained. It includes the house, the construction business assets, and several financial accounts. Daniel looked back down at the paper again as if trying to process what he was seeing. Ashley's eyes moved quickly across the lines of text. What does that mean exactly? She asked. Her voice remained polite, though the confidence she had displayed earlier now sounded more careful. I folded my hands gently together again. It means the house and the business remain protected within the trust, I said. And according to your father's instructions, I am the trustee responsible for managing those assets. Daniel looked at me quietly, absorbing the information. Ashley glanced at him briefly before returning her attention to the document. For a moment no one spoke. The late afternoon light continued to shift slowly across the living room floor while the maple leaves outside the window moved softly in the breeze. Edward had always believed that strong foundations were built long before storms arrived. Sitting there in the quiet living room, watching Daniel and Ashley read the documents he arranged so carefully, I understood once again how thoroughly my husband had prepared for the future. I watched quietly as Daniel and Ashley continued reading the document on the coffee table, their eyes moving slowly across the lines that Robert Keller had explained so clearly earlier that morning. The living room felt unusually still, the kind of stillness that appears when people realize that the situation they believed they understood has quietly shifted into something different. Outside the window, the maple tree moved gently in the late afternoon breeze, its leaves glowing softly as the sun lowered toward the horizon. Daniel was the first to speak. He lifted his head and looked at me with an expression that carried both surprise and uncertainty. "So the house is part of the trust?" he asked carefully. I nodded calmly. "Yes," I said. "Your father believed that protecting the home was important. He wanted to make sure everything remained stable." Daniel glanced back down at the paper again, reading the section that explained the role of the trustee. Ashley leaned closer beside him, studying the same paragraph. The confidence she had shown earlier in the conversation had softened into something more cautious now. "But eventually the house will still go to Daniel, right?" she asked after a moment. Her voice remained polite, though it carried a careful curiosity. I folded my hands gently together and spoke with the same quiet patience Edward always admired. "Your father made detailed plans for the future," I said. "But for now, the responsibility remains with me." Daniel read another page of the document and nodded slowly, as if the explanation was beginning to make sense. Ashley's eyes moved across the final section of the paper, and for a brief moment she seemed unsure what to say next. The grandfather clock in the hallway ticked steadily while the room remained quiet. I could almost hear Edward's voice in my memory reminding me that clear decisions create calm outcomes. After a moment, Daniel placed the paper back on the coffee table and leaned back in his chair. "Dad always believed in planning ahead," he said softly. I smiled slightly. "Yes," I replied. "He did." Ashley straightened on the sofa and brushed a small strand of hair away from her face before speaking again. "I suppose that makes sense," she said, though the certainty from earlier had faded into something more thoughtful. "He was always very organized about business matters." I nodded gently. "Your father approached family matters with the same care." For several seconds no one spoke. The quiet sunlight continued to shift across the floor, touching the photographs on the mantel and the edges of Edward's armchair near the window. Finally Daniel stood and walked slowly toward the window, looking out at the maple tree his father had planted decades earlier. "Dad really loved this place," he said quietly. I watched him for a moment before responding. "He believed a home should remain steady," I said. "Something people could rely on." Daniel nodded once more, and for the first time since he arrived that afternoon his expression seemed calmer. Ashley looked down again at the documents on the table before gently closing the folder. "Well," she said, choosing her words carefully, "it sounds like everything has already been arranged the way Edward wanted." I met her eyes calmly. "Yes," I replied. "He took great care to make sure of that." The tension that had quietly filled the room earlier in the conversation had begun to fade, replaced by the steady clarity that comes when facts settle into place. Daniel returned to his seat and rested his hands on his knees. "I am glad you spoke with Robert Keller," he said. "Dad always trusted him." I nodded. "That is exactly why your father asked me to remember him." Ashley stood and walked slowly toward the hallway, glancing once more at the photographs on the wall. "Edward always thought of everything," she said quietly. I did not respond immediately. Instead I looked once more toward the maple tree outside the window, its branches moving softly in the evening breeze. Edward had planted that tree when Daniel was still a baby, long before anyone could imagine the many seasons our family would pass through together. Trees, like careful plans, grow slowly over time until their strength becomes impossible to overlook. After a few moments Daniel gathered his coat and Ashley returned to the living room. They thanked me for explaining the documents and prepared to leave. I walked with them to the front door, where the fading sunlight had begun turning the sky a soft golden color above the quiet street. As they stepped onto the porch, Daniel paused briefly and looked back at the house. "Dad built something really solid here," he said thoughtfully. I nodded once more, feeling the calm certainty that Edward's planning had created. "Yes," I said gently. "He did." The door closed softly behind them, and the house returned to its familiar evening quiet. The grandfather clock continued its steady rhythm while the maple leaves outside moved softly in the cooling air. Edward had spent his life building homes that were meant to last. And as I stood there in the quiet hallway, I understood that the structure he left behind was not only made of wood and stone, but of foresight, patience, and a quiet promise that the future of this home would remain exactly as he intended.